Today is International Polar Bear Day, February 27th, and I work at the Wilder Institute Calgary Zoo, which on December 1st, 2023, reopened the Canadian section of the zoo, now called Wild Canada, which was closed off and on for construction to build this brand new state-of-the-art polar bear habitat, as well as revamping other species habitats within the Canada section. But the polar bears have certainly been the highlight of this brand new area reopening. So I thought for this video I will share with you all some interesting things that I have learned by researching, as well as different things I've learned by working with the public and teaching people, answering questions, telling stories about the polar bears, as well as all the other species that live in that area, which is what my job is, working with the people, not with the animals per se. And so I've learned some interesting things. So first of all, I would like to talk about things that I've learned about the public's perception of polar bears. So about the general awareness and understanding that we average everyday people have about polar bears. So a few interesting things stand out. This area opened during the winter, which it's actually ended up being a really mild winter here in Calgary, which is kind of interesting because a big part of having the polar bears here is for us to spread awareness about issues that their species face in the wild or are projected to face in the future, which mainly is climate change. And if the Arctic continues to warm and the sea ice forms less and less, polar bears are going to struggle going forward. And so a big part of what I'm doing and other people on my team are doing when we talk to people about polar bears is also bringing awareness to this fact about what their species face in the wild and going forward into the future. And I think it's ironic in a sort of a horrible way that it's been a really mild and warm winter, which is unseasonal for us. However, I should say that, of course, you can't say that just because it's been a warm winter or it's been a really hot summer that means that climate change is so horrible in this moment and that we're all doomed, right? This could be just a seasonal fluctuation, and this could just be a, warm and mild winter. Now, unfortunately, it does look as though the trends are winters are continuing to get warmer and warmer. That is true throughout Canada, especially true in the Arctic, where the polar bears live. So I say all of that just to say that as we continue to educate ourselves and understand the effects of climatic changes, it doesn't take a climate scientist to observe that the seasons are changing. Now, of course, you need this data over long periods of time, and you can't jump to one conclusion based off of just a few unseasonably warm winters. But, these things do go hand in hand, and there are trends that just average everyday people can notice. So, with that said, in terms of how polar bears live in the wild, it's interesting. I would get this question often from visitors, and they would say, what are you going to do with the polar bears during the summer? And for a while, I would just answer it like, how polar bears will, what they will do during the summer. And so we try to mimic how they live in the wild as much as we can. So that means that during the winter, right now, from, November through to March, maybe into April, that is when polar bears are eating a lot of food, because that is when the sea ice is formed and they can be out on the sea ice where they hunt seals from. During the summer, when the sea ice is no longer, then polar bears are inland and they're not able to hunt seals from the land. They require that sea ice to be out on the waters and hunting seals, which is their main food source in the wild. So they're eating large quantities of food during the winter months. During the summer, they're either fasting, going completely without food, or just browsing on small amounts of Arctic vegetation. So maybe some crowberries or blueberries or other plants that grow in the Arctic, or even foraging at the water's edge for seaweed. Or maybe they've found some carrion, maybe a beached whale or something like that, or increasingly so, going into human settlements and foraging through human garbage for food. But for the most part, they're not eating a lot of food during the summer. So I would explain these sorts of dynamics to people when they would ask what the polar bears do in the summer, assuming that that is what their question is. But more and more I realize that they're not so much asking what do polar bears do in the summer as opposed to what do they do in the winter. And it seemed as though people were asking in a more perplexed manner, as though polar bears cannot exist in warm temperatures, as though where they live in the wild, it is always cold all the time. Now this, of course, is not true. The Arctic gets summer, and they will have warmer temperatures, depending on the regions, of course, and there's different polar bear populations. There's 19 scientifically tracked polar bear populations in the world, and maybe as a side fact here, the majority of polar bears in the world live in Canada. Somewhere between 60 to 80% live in the high Arctic of Canada. Now, they do live around the Arctic Circle, so that's in Russia, in Greenland, as well as Norway, and then, of course, in Alaska as well. So they live around the Arctic Circle. Funny enough, and this is another side note, they don't live in Iceland, and that is where I've spent my last 2 summers, is in Iceland. So I've gotten a little taste of what Arctic life is, but Iceland is more of an anomaly. It's an island in this kind of weird locale where I guess because of trade winds and maybe ocean currents too, they get mild temperatures year-round. So Iceland never gets too hot in the summer, which was quite nice to be there last summer when it was very hot here in Calgary. I missed a very dry and hot summer. But then it never gets too cold in Iceland during the winter. They would stay more mild throughout the year and get a lot of rain and not as much snow. Here in Calgary, we usually get lots of snow, which we still have gotten a fair bit this winter. And usually, minus 20 to minus 30 degrees Celsius days will happen throughout the winter from November to March. So it gets much colder here even, and we're like very far south compared to the Arctic in Canada. So sea ice doesn't form around Iceland, and that's the reason why polar bears don't go to Iceland, although they make the odd appearance there, and you'll get a polar bear that will swim over or drift over on sea ice, and sea ice will form sometimes around Iceland, but it's not permanent, therefore polar bears aren't established there and hunting seals from Iceland. Although where it is in the proximity to the Arctic Circle could very well have been a place for polar bears to live had there been sea ice forming around Iceland. Well, that is a side tangent, and that is a example though. However, the more you understand about the Arctic, all around the Arctic Circle, okay, not just Arctic Canada, but in Russia and Norway and these other places too, the more you can understand how polar bears live. And you'll realize that polar bears would experience summer temperatures. Maybe 20 degrees Celsius could be a quite warm day there, but then it's much different too. Okay, so the sun never fully sets in the high Arctic during the summer solstice. You'll get 24 hours of daylight, which is an interesting dynamic to consider and something quite cool to experience, and I got to see that while I was in Iceland. So polar bears naturally experience the summer, and they do different things. Again, they're inland. They're not out on the sea ice, so they're not eating as much food, or in some cases, just not eating any food in general. They're completely fasting. So winter is prime time for polar bears, but they are still able to exist during warmer seasons. And they do that naturally in the wild, too. And I realized that this is what people were asking. They maybe have this understanding all around the Arctic Circle, okay, not just Arctic Canada, but in Russia and Norway and these other places too, the more you can understand how polar bears live. And you'll realize that polar bears would experience summer temperatures. Maybe 20 degrees Celsius could be a quite warm day there, but then it's much different too. Okay, so the sun never fully sets in the high Arctic during the summer solstice. You'll get 24 hours of daylight, which is an interesting dynamic to consider and something quite cool to experience, and I got to see that while I was in Iceland. So polar bears naturally experience the summer, And they do different things. Again, they're inland. They're not out on the sea ice, so they're not eating as much food, or in some cases, just not eating any food in general. They're completely fasting. So winter is prime time for polar bears, but they are still able to exist during warmer seasons. And they do that naturally in the wild, too. And I realized that this is what people were asking. They maybe have this understanding of penguins, for example. And this will get us to another point that I've learned about our understanding of polar bears, and this is probably due to media. Christmas time, you'll get an ornament of a penguin and you'll hang it on your Christmas tree next to an ornament of a polar bear. Or in a cartoon or something, you'll see polar bears and penguins and Santa Claus riding on his reindeer. So these sorts of things skew our perception. But of course, penguins live in the southern hemisphere and polar bears live in the north. They are literally polar opposites, which I realize that this is more or less what people are asking when they ask what polar bears will do during the summer. There does seem to be a lot of these misconceptions about wildlife. And so the penguins and polar bears living in the same region is one such misconception that a lot of people have, children and adults alike. Now, there's just one species of polar bear. There's subpopulations, but they're all the same species. So they're all adapted for the same regions. Whereas penguins, there's different species. Some of them live right in and around Antarctica, others live in warmer regions. But if people were going based off the example of penguins at the zoo, the cold weather penguin species, such as the king penguin, they cannot come outside during the summertime. They have to stay within their climate-controlled environment during the summer months. They can come out in the winter when it's cold enough for them, but they would not do well in warm temperatures. And I think people use this example and think that polar bears would require some indoor climate-controlled habitat to have minus 20 degrees Celsius temperatures year-round. They do not, in fact. And explaining these different dynamics, of course there's people visiting from other countries to our zoo, but a lot of us coming here are locals and are Canadians. But even though we are Canadian and we live in Arctic environments during the winter, a lot of us still do not actually understand the real Arctic. We don't know the dynamics of the Arctic ecosystems. And so I think this has been a great opportunity for me to teach people about the Arctic and about the polar bears. And, my favorite saying as it pertains to my job and, the things that I pursue is the best way to learn is to teach. And so I have not been a polar bear expert, but I've certainly been getting quite the education in polar bears. And it's been amazing to be able to teach others as I learn myself as I go through this.